The Galactic Council had existed for over 4,000 years. 11 great empires sat at its table. The Vreth, the Solani, the Keth Dominion, the Orokai Collective, and 7 others whose names stretched back to the earliest days of interstellar civilization. They had fought wars, signed treaties, broken them, and signed new ones. They had watched stars die and new ones ignite. They had seen species rise and collapse under the weight of their own ambition. And through all of it, not one of them had ever feared another the way they now feared humanity. It had not always been this way. When the first human ship crossed into Vreth space, the Vreth High Admiral barely glanced at the report. A small vessel, a primitive warp drive that burned fuel at a rate most junior engineers would consider embarrassing. The hull plating was thick but unsophisticated, the weapons laughably basic. The crew numbered 43. The Vreth recorded the encounter, filed it under pre-contact species, Category 5, non-threatening, and moved on to more pressing matters. That was 40 years ago. Today, the same High Admiral sat in a sealed chamber deep inside the Vreth homeworld, staring at intelligence reports that made his secondary heart beat irregularly. Across from him sat ambassadors from 6 other council empires, all wearing the same expression, the quiet, carefully controlled look of people who refused to let their fear show but could not quite manage to hide it entirely. The report on the table was titled, Human 7th War Fleet, Current Position and Projected Trajectory. The Vreth High Admiral cleared his throat. How many ships? The intelligence officer did not look up from his datapad. 412 warships, sir. That includes 67 dreadnoughts, 114 heavy cruisers, and the rest split between destroyers and support vessels. Additionally, there are 22 carrier platforms, each housing between 80 and 120 fighter craft. Silence settled over the room like a heavy fog. 40 years. That was all it had taken. 40 years from a single scout vessel with 43 crew members to a war fleet that could challenge the combined naval power of 3 mid-tier council empires simultaneously. No species in recorded galactic history had ever militarized at that pace. Not the Keth during the Dominion Wars. Not the Orokai when they had consumed 6 neighboring systems in a single century. Nobody. The Solani ambassador leaned forward. She was tall, silver-skinned, and had lived for 300 years. She had seen things that would have broken a human mind, and yet her voice carried a tremor when she spoke. We need to understand what we are dealing with. Not the ships, not the weapons, the people. That was the correct question. Everyone in the room knew it. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy. The Keth were physically more powerful, with dense muscle structures that could crush stone and nervous systems that processed pain as a mild inconvenience. The Solani were more intelligent on average, their brains running cognitive operations that humans needed computers to match. The Orokai had natural regeneration that made them nearly impossible to kill in ground combat. Humans, by comparison, were soft, fragile. They bled easily. They broke bones. They needed sleep and food and warmth just to survive. And yet here they were, with 412 warships and counting. The Vreth intelligence officer pulled up a secondary file. Our embedded observers have been tracking human military development since first contact. The pattern is consistent and, frankly, alarming. He projected a holographic graph into the center of the room. Human military growth follows what their own scientists call an exponential curve. Each generation of warship is not simply an improvement on the last. It is a fundamental reimagining of the concept. Their first dreadnoughts, built 31 years ago, were powerful but conventional. Their current dreadnoughts are something else entirely. He switched the projection to a detailed schematic. The humans called the ship class the Resolute. It was enormous, nearly 4 kilometers from bow to stern, but what made it terrifying was not its size. It was the layered defense architecture. 7 separate shielding systems, each operating on a different physical principle, designed so that defeating one would not compromise the others. The weapon systems were equally disturbing. Kinetic accelerators that could hurl a tungsten rod at 30% of light speed. Plasma lances capable of sustained fire for 40 continuous minutes without cooling failure. And something the intelligence file labeled simply as the collapsed torpedo, a weapon whose exact mechanism the Vreth had not yet been able to determine, but whose effects had been observed once, during a human military exercise near the Barith Nebula. The collapsed torpedo had turned a small moon into a debris field in 6 seconds. The Keth ambassador, who had been quiet until now, shifted in his seat. He was massive even by Keth standards, nearly 3 meters tall and built like a walking fortress. When he spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. The weapon system is frightening. But the weapon system is not what concerns me. Everyone looked at him. I have studied human history, he said slowly. Not their recent history. Their old history. What they did to each other before they ever looked at the stars. He paused. They spent 10,000 years in continuous warfare. Not raiding. Not territorial skirmishes. Total warfare. They invented chemical weapons, and then banned them, and then used them again. They split the atom, and the first thing they did was build a bomb. They engineered diseases as weapons. They burned entire cities from the air. They fought wars so large that the whole planet was involved. He looked around the table, and then they stopped. Another silence. They stopped, he repeated, and built schools and hospitals, and wrote music and painted pictures, and sent telescopes into the dark to look at the beauty of the universe. And in the same generation that did all of that, the same generation, they also started building war fleets. His eyes were steady. A species that can do both of those things at the same time is not a species that stumbled into military power. It is a species that chose it, deliberately, with full understanding of what it means. The Solani ambassador pressed her fingers together. The question before this council is whether the human war fleets represent a threat to galactic stability. The question before this council, the Vreth High Admiral said quietly, is whether we are already too late to do anything about it, even if they do. Nobody answered him, because nobody had an answer. Outside the sealed chamber, somewhere in the vast dark between stars, the human 7th War Fleet continued its patrol route along the outer edge of Vreth space. Not threatening, not aggressive, just present, moving in perfect formation with the quiet, unhurried confidence of something that did not need to rush because it already knew the outcome of any confrontation it might face. On the bridge of the flagship, the USCS Enduring Will, Fleet Admiral Yara Osei stood at the observation window and watched the stars drift past. She was 54 years old, had commanded ships for 30 years, and had never fired a weapon in anger against another species. She hoped she never would. But she had also read the same history the Keth ambassador had read. She knew what humanity was capable of when pushed. She knew the deep, ancient machinery that lived inside her species, patient and cold and enormously powerful. And she knew that the best way to make sure it never woke up was to make sure nobody was ever stupid enough to try and push them in the first place. That was why the fleet was here. Not to start a war. To prevent one. To be seen. To be measured. To be understood. The stars outside the window were silent and indifferent. But somewhere in the dark, she knew, 11 great empires were watching her fleet and quietly recalculating everything they thought they knew about their place in the galaxy. Good, she thought. Let them recalculate. The Orokai Collective had never lost a naval engagement. In 1,100 years of recorded conflict, their war fleets had fought 47 major battles and won every single one. Their tactics were considered masterworks of galactic military strategy, patient, layered, designed to crush opponents under the weight of superior numbers and resource denial. They did not fight fast wars. They fought long ones, grinding enemies down across years and decades until there was nothing left to grind. They understood this about themselves. They were proud of it, which was why, when the Orokai Intelligence Bureau placed its first serious assessment of human military doctrine on the Supreme Commander's desk, the reaction was not fear. It was dismissal. They are aggressive, the Supreme Commander said, skimming the report. Impulsive. They commit ships forward before the strategic picture is clear. They take risks that no rational commander would take. He set the report down. They will burn themselves out in any prolonged engagement. The Intelligence Bureau analyst who had written the report, a careful, thorough officer named Specialist Varric, did not argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with the Supreme Commander was a waste of everyone's time. Instead, she waited. She was patient. She had been watching humanity for 11 years, and she had learned that patience was the correct response to almost everything involving them. She waited 7 months. Then the Barith incident happened, and suddenly everyone in the Orokai Collective wanted to read her report again. The Barith incident was not a war. It did not even qualify as a skirmish under the Council's official definitions. What it was, technically, was a misunderstanding. A Keth patrol fleet that had crossed into a region humanity had quietly claimed as a protected buffer zone around 3 uninhabited but resource-rich systems. The Keth patrol commander had not known about the buffer zone. His maps were outdated. He had led his 12 ships into the area in good faith, conducting routine operations, and had been utterly blindsided when human ships appeared. Not a few ships. Not a patrol vessel with a warning. 47 warships. Present within 6 minutes of the Keth patrol's entry into the buffer zone. 47 warships that had clearly been staged, positioned, and waiting, not for the Keth specifically, but for anyone. The human response doctrine apparently did not distinguish between who crossed the line, only that someone had. The Keth patrol commander later described the experience in a debrief that was subsequently shared with every major intelligence service in the galaxy. They did not hail us immediately, he said. They formed up around us. All 47 ships. In a formation I had never seen before. A full enclosure pattern, every angle covered, no gaps. And then they hailed us. Very calmly. A human officer, young, female, spoke to me for approximately 4 minutes. She explained the buffer zone. She provided the original council filing documentation in real time. She asked if I understood. I said yes. She said good, and asked us to please exit via the route we had entered so that our engine signatures could be logged for the record. He paused in the transcript. They were not hostile. They were not threatening in their tone. But those 47 ships never moved. Not 1 meter. They held that enclosure around my 12 ships for the entire conversation and for the entire duration of our exit. And I understood, in a way I have never understood anything more clearly in my career, that if I had made a different choice, if I had been aggressive, or stupid, or simply afraid and acted on it, those 47 ships would have ended my patrol fleet in minutes. That debrief traveled fast. The Orokai Collective read it. Then they pulled Specialist Varric's report back out and read it again, more carefully this time. What Varric had understood, and what she had tried and failed to communicate to the Supreme Commander months earlier, was that human military doctrine only looked impulsive from the outside. It only looked like aggression from a distance. Up close, when you studied the actual mechanics of how human commanders made decisions and positioned their forces, it was something else entirely. Something that the Orokai, with their deep appreciation for long war strategy, found genuinely difficult to process. Humans did not fight the way they lived. In civilian life, in diplomacy, in science and commerce, humanity operated on human timescales, years, decades, the slow building of things that were meant to last. But in military operations, they compressed. They accelerated. They made decisions in seconds that other species commanders would have spent hours deliberating over. And those decisions were not reckless. They were practiced, drilled into every officer through training regimens so intensive that Vreth military analysts who had reviewed them compared the result to something closer to instinct than thought. A human fleet commander did not think about what to do when an unexpected threat appeared. She already knew. The decision had been made 1,000 times in simulation, in exercise, in the accumulated muscle memory of a species that had spent 10,000 years fighting and had, at some point, gotten very good at it. Varric laid this out in a follow-up memo that she sent to the Supreme Commander without being asked. She included a specific example that she thought illustrated the point better than anything else could. During a joint council military exercise held 3 years prior, human forces had been assigned a defensive scenario: hold a position against a simulated attacking force twice their size for 72 hours. The attacking force was Solani, using the Council's best tactical AI systems to model their fleet movements. The exercise was designed to be difficult. Most Council military planners estimated that human forces, given the odds, might realistically hold for 40 to 50 hours before being forced to retreat. The humans had not held. They had attacked. On the 4th hour of the exercise, without warning and against every expectation, the entire human defensive force had pivoted and launched a full offensive strike at the Solani fleet's command element. The Solani tactical AI had not been designed to model that possibility, not because it was impossible, but because no rational commander with half the forces and a defensive mandate would ever consider it a viable option. The AI assessed the probability of that choice at less than 1% and had allocated no meaningful resources to countering it. The human commander had known that, had counted on it, had turned the AI's own logic against it. The exercise was declared a human victory in 11 hours. When the Solani fleet commander had asked the human admiral afterward why he had made that call, the admiral had shrugged and said, "Defense without the option to attack is just a slower way to lose. We don't do slower ways to lose." Varric had included that quote at the end of her memo. The Supreme Commander read it twice, set it down, and then did something he almost never did. He called Varric directly into his office and asked her, plainly and without ceremony, what she thought the Urukai Collective should do about humanity. She had thought about this question for 11 years. She had her answer ready. "Nothing hostile," she said. "Not now, not ever, if we can avoid it." The window for that closed approximately 25 years ago, when their first carrier platforms came online. What we should do is exactly what we are already doing: trade, diplomacy, careful respect for their stated boundaries, and no surprises. Humans respond well to honesty and very badly to deception. They have very long institutional memories. If we are straightforward with them, they will be straightforward with us. That is a good arrangement. And if another empire is not so careful? The Supreme Commander asked. Varric was quiet for a moment. Outside the window of his office, the lights of the Urukai homeworld glittered across a dark ocean. It was beautiful. She found herself hoping it would remain so. "Then we make sure we are not standing next to them when they find out," she said. The Supreme Commander nodded slowly. He picked up the memo again and read the quote at the end one more time. Then he placed it in the priority file, the one reserved for threats to Urukai survival, and left it there. Not because he expected war, because he had read enough history, human and otherwise, to know that the empires most likely to stumble into catastrophe were always the ones that stopped taking threats seriously the moment those threats stopped being immediately visible. Humanity's war fleets were always visible. That was the entire point of them. And the Supreme Commander had finally, 7 months too late, but not too late for it to matter, understood exactly what that visibility was meant to communicate. We are here. We have always been here. And we are paying attention. There was a moment, early in the contact period, when a young Solani diplomat named Thesson had asked a human officer a question that seemed simple. The officer was a commander in the Earth Unified Navy, a weathered man in his late 40s named Harlow, who had been assigned as a military liaison to the first Joint Council Humanity Diplomatic Summit. They were standing on a balcony overlooking the summit city, watching the sun set over a pale violet sea, and Thesson had been trying to understand something that none of his briefing documents had adequately explained. "Why so many ships?" he asked. "Your civilization is not at war with anyone. You have no active enemies." The Council extended the offer of protected status at first contact, which means no empire could legally attack you without Council sanction. So why build a fleet of this scale? Why spend so many resources on weapons you have no reason to use? Harlow had been quiet for a long time, watching the light change on the water. "How long did the Council's protected status offer last?" he finally asked. Thesson blinked. "It is permanent. Standard policy for pre-contact civilizations." "Right," Harlow said. "And how many times in Council history has a protected species actually been attacked anyway? By an empire that just decided the legal consequences were worth it?" Thesson opened his mouth and then closed it again. 14 times, Harlow said, not unkindly. "We looked it up. 14 times in 4,000 years, an empire decided that some protected species was worth the political fallout. Of those 14 species, 11 no longer exist." He paused. "We read a lot of history before we came out here. We wanted to understand the neighborhood before we moved in." He looked at Thesson steadily. "The ships are not because we are at war. The ships are because we intend to make sure we never need to be." That conversation happened 38 years ago. Thesson was now the Solani ambassador to the Galactic Council, and he thought about it regularly, especially on days like today, when the Council's emergency session had been called to address what the Keth Dominion was, with remarkable and deliberate understatement, calling the frontier situation. The frontier situation was, in plain language, a war. The Keth Dominion had expanded aggressively into a region of space that 3 smaller species, the Pelari, the Yun Collective, and a newly contacted group called the Deshi, had all been occupying peacefully for generations. The Keth had presented legal arguments about prior survey rights, ancient territorial claims, and resource necessity. The arguments were not entirely without basis. They were also, as everyone at the council table understood perfectly well, beside the point. The Keth were powerful. The Pelari, the Yun, and the Deshi were not. The legal arguments were window dressing on what was fundamentally a stronger species deciding that it wanted something and taking it. The council had issued 3 formal condemnations in 6 months. The Keth had ignored all 3. And then, without fanfare, without a formal announcement, without even a notification to the council's military oversight committee, the human Ninth War Fleet had repositioned. From its standard patrol route along the outer rim, it had moved, quietly, in stages, over the course of about 2 weeks, to a position that placed it directly between the Keth advance forces and the remaining Deshi inhabited worlds. Nobody had asked them to do this. Nobody had authorized it. The humans had simply looked at the situation, made a decision, and moved. The Keth advance stopped. Not because the Ninth Fleet had fired a single shot. Not because any human commander had issued an ultimatum. The advance stopped because the Keth military planners ran the numbers and found them catastrophic. The Ninth Fleet comprised 308 warships. The Keth advance force was 160. Even with Keth individual combat superiority, the math was not survivable. And the Keth, whatever their moral failings, had not survived 1,100 years of warfare by making suicidal commitments. The advance stopped, and then the Keth ambassador arrived at the emergency council session looking like a man trying very hard to project calm while sitting on a fire. He argued that the human repositioning was unprovoked, that it represented unilateral interference in a legal dominion territorial action, that the council should formally censure humanity for deploying military forces without authorization. Thessan listened to the argument with the patience of a very old diplomat, and then, when his turn came, simply asked one question. Under the council charter, Article 41, Paragraph 7, does any member empire have the right to deploy its own military forces within its own recognized patrol corridors? The legal answer was yes. Everyone knew the answer was yes. The Ninth Fleet's new position was, technically, within a disputed corridor that humanity had quietly filed a patrol rights claim on 2 years ago. At the time, nobody had paid attention to the filing. It had seemed like bureaucratic routine. It had not been bureaucratic routine. The Keth ambassador sat down. He did not look like a man who had lost an argument. He looked like a man who had just understood, fully and completely, that he was dealing with something that had been 3 moves ahead of him before the game started. After the session, Thessan found himself walking the long gallery outside the council chambers with the human diplomatic representative, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Ambassador Dara Chun, who had been in the role for 6 years and who had, in Thessan's observation, never once been caught off guard by anything. The patrol rights filing, Thessan said. 2 years ago. Chin said, which was not a confirmation but was not a denial either. You were watching the Keth expansion. You saw where it was going. We watch a lot of things, she said pleasantly. You positioned the legal basis for intervention before the intervention was needed. She looked at him sideways. That seems like responsible planning to me. Thessan thought about Commander Harlow on the balcony, 38 years ago. He thought about the 14 protected species, 11 of which no longer existed. He thought about the Deshi, who were alive right now because a fleet of human warships had moved to stand between them and an empire that had decided their home was more valuable than their lives. The other empires are frightened of your war fleets, he said. I want you to understand that I am not. What I feel is something more complicated. Chen waited. When I was young, he said, my people had a concept, a word in Old Solani that does not translate well. It describes the feeling of standing next to something very powerful and knowing that its power is directed outward, away from you. Not safety, exactly. More like the absence of a fear you did not know you were carrying. Chen was quiet for a moment. That's a good word, she said, even without a translation. The Pelari sent a message to the council this morning, Thessan said, thanking the human government for the fleet repositioning. The Yun Collective sent one as well. I know, Chen said. We got them. The Deshi sent something different. Our translators were not entirely sure how to render it. The closest approximation was, he paused, searching for the right words, something like, We did not know you existed until last month, and now we know that you do, and we are glad. Chin's expression shifted, just slightly. Not a smile exactly, but something near one. Something quieter. We got that one too, she said. Admiral Osei read it to the Ninth Fleet crew over ship-wide comms. They walked in silence for a moment, the gallery windows showing the stars outside in slow, cold indifference. The Keth will not forget this, Thessin said finally. No, Chin agreed. They won't. They will wait. They will look for an opportunity. They have long memories. Chin nodded slowly. So do we. And that, Thessin thought, as they parted ways at the end of the gallery, was perhaps the thing that made humanity most different from every other spacefaring species he had encountered in 300 years of diplomacy. Not the ships, not the weapons, not even the strategic patience that had placed a legal filing in exactly the right position 2 years before anyone knew it would be needed. It was the memory, the deep, unbroken line connecting humanity to every war it had ever fought and every peace it had ever built. They carried their history with them, not as a burden, but as a reference, as a manual, as a reminder of every mistake and every consequence, held close so that the same mistakes did not have to be made twice. The stars outside the window did not care about any of this, but the species living under them did. And some of those species, the ones paying attention, were starting to understand that the human war fleets in the dark between stars were not a threat to be managed or a problem to be solved. They were a promise, and the promise was very simple. This will not happen here. Not while we are watching. The Vreth called the engagement at Sorith's Crossing the most efficient military action in 4,000 years of recorded galactic warfare. They did not mean it as a compliment. Exactly. It was more the kind of statement a person makes when they witness something they cannot entirely explain and lack any better language to describe it. The Sorith's Crossing incident began with the Ythrani. The Ythrani were not a council member. They were a mercenary alliance, a loose collection of 15 species operating warships for profit across the outer sectors, powerful enough to threaten smaller civilizations, but historically smart enough to stay clear of council members and their protected territories. For 200 years they had existed in that careful middle space, dangerous but manageable, like a predator that understood the boundaries of its territory. Then the Ythrani leadership changed. The new Archon, a ruthless strategic mind named Vorsikit, had a different philosophy. He had studied the council for years and concluded that its power rested on bluff and precedent rather than genuine military capacity. The member empires were rich and comfortable. They had not fought a real war in decades. Their fleets were maintained more for politics than for genuine combat readiness. And their newest member, the humans, were, in his estimation, simply too new to the galactic stage to understand what a real multi-vector military assault looked like. Vorsikit spent 3 years planning. He recruited, trained, and equipped a force of 240 warships. He identified 6 council-adjacent systems occupied by wealthy, but lightly defended civilizations. He built a logistics chain capable of sustaining operations for 2 years. He mapped every known human patrol route with painstaking care and identified what he believed was a 6-week window in which the human 3rd and 5th War fleets would both be at maximum distance from the target systems, rotated out for maintenance and resupply. He executed the plan on a Tuesday. Within 48 hours, 3 of his 6 target systems had been secured. His forces were moving faster than projections. The plan was working. On Thursday morning, he received a transmission. It was from a human admiral named Vice Admiral James Okafor, commanding officer of something called Task Group 77. Okafor was a compact man with close-cropped gray hair and the measured delivery of someone who had given a great many briefings to people who did not want to hear what he was saying. His message was 90 seconds long. In those 90 seconds, he explained, without apparent emotion, that Task Group 77 had been operating in stealth configuration in the outer sectors for 11 months, that it consisted of 89 warships, that it was currently positioned at Sorith's Crossing, directly astride the Ythrani fleet's supply line, that the 3rd Fleet, contrary to Vorsikit's intelligence, had completed its maintenance rotation 6 weeks early due to upgraded repair facilities at the human station at Kepler's Reach, and was now staged at a secondary position 40 light minutes from the Ythrani rear. and that Vorsikit had 30 minutes to begin a full withdrawal from all occupied systems, or the next transmission he received would not be a conversation. Vorsikit had spent 3 years on his plan. He had believed, genuinely believed, based on the best intelligence available to him, that the human patrol rotations gave him a window. What he had not accounted for, what none of his analysts had flagged, was that the human fleet deployment doctrine did not rely on any single patrol schedule. The visible fleet, the ships that showed up on every sensor, logged their positions in Council navigation systems, and followed predictable routes, was only part of the picture. The other part operated in silence. No transponders, no navigation filings, no predictable patterns. Just ships in the dark, watching, waiting, present in places nobody expected them to be. Task Group 77 had been watching Vorsikit build his plan for 11 months. They had not intervened. They had not warned anyone. They had simply watched and prepared and waited for the moment when intervention would be most instructive. Vorsikit had 30 minutes. He used 22 of them considering his options before concluding that he did not have any. He issued the withdrawal order. The debrief that followed was, by every account, deeply uncomfortable for the Ythrani Archon. Human naval investigators spent 3 weeks reviewing his entire operational plan with him, piece by piece, pointing out every place where his intelligence had been compromised, every assumption that had been wrong, every moment where the invisible layer of human strategic deployment had been watching him without his knowledge. They were not cruel about it. They were thorough and clinical and precise, in the way that made it worse. At the end of the 3 weeks, Vorsikit sat across from Okafor and asked the question that had been building in him since Thursday morning. How long have you been doing this? The stealth deployment. How long have you had ships out there that nobody could track? Okafor looked at him for a moment. How long have we been a spacefaring species? He asked. Vorsikit did not immediately understand the answer, but he thought about it for a long time afterward, and eventually he did. The Sorith's crossing incident traveled through galactic diplomatic channels the way catastrophic events always do, fast, loud, and with an enormous amount of analysis attached. Every intelligence service in every Council empire pulled the incident report and spent considerable time with it. The Vreth High Admiral read it 3 times. The Orokai Supreme Commander convened a special briefing. The Keth Dominion's military command, still raw from the frontier situation, reviewed it in near silence. What they were all trying to understand was not what had happened. The events were clear enough. What they were trying to understand was the doctrine, the invisible layer, the ships in the dark. The Vreth intelligence assessment, eventually shared with all Council members, put it this way. Human strategic deployment appears to operate on at least 2 simultaneous levels. The first level is visible, logged, and predictable, designed to be seen and measured. The second level is invisible by design and appears to have been maintained continuously since early in the contact period. The full extent of the second-level deployment is, by definition, unknown. What Sorith's crossing demonstrates is that wherever a potential threat has been developing, a human force has been present to observe it. The implication is significant. There is no region of contested or strategic space in which human forces should be assumed to be absent simply because they have not been observed. The implication was significant. Every senior military commander in every Council empire read that line and felt, with varying degrees of discomfort, the ground shift slightly beneath their assumptions. Because it meant that the war fleets were not just in the places you could see them. They were in the places you could not see them. They had been there for years, watching, learning the patterns, noting the plans, and waiting with the deep patience of a species that had spent 10,000 years learning that the best time to act was not immediately, but precisely, at the moment when action would matter most and cost least. The Pelari, the Yun, and the Deshi sent another round of messages to the human government after Sorith's crossing. The Pelari message was formal and diplomatic. The Yun message was effusive and long. The Deshi message was 3 words, translated into English by a program that had been learning their language for 4 months. We see you. Admiral Osei, who had been given command of the combined 1st and 9th Fleets 6 months earlier, read all 3 messages in her office on the USCS Enduring Will, now running as the flagship of a combined force that made it, by any reasonable measure, the most powerful single military command in galactic history. She thought about Harlow on the balcony. She thought about the 11 species that were no longer there to send messages. She thought about all the things humanity had done to itself over 10,000 years, and all the things it had eventually chosen to become. She thought about the Deshi, a species that had existed in peaceful obscurity for generations, that had not known humanity existed until last month, that had been days from annihilation by an empire that wanted their home, and that had been saved by a fleet of ships that had been watching from the dark before anyone knew there was anything to watch for. "We see you." She had the message framed and put it on the wall of her office, next to the window where she watched the stars on long patrol nights. Not as a monument, not as a trophy, just as a reminder of what all of this was for. Outside, the fleet moved through the dark in its quiet, endless patrol, visible ships and invisible ones, layer upon layer, present in the spaces between civilizations where history had taught humanity that the worst things tended to happen. 11 empires lay in the light of their home stars, building and trading and arguing and living, and most of their citizens went about their days without thinking about the dark between those stars or what moved through it. That was fine. That was the point. The dark was watched. The line was held. And whatever came next, whatever ambition rose or patience ran out or old grievances decided they were tired of being grievances, it would find, as everyone who had tested the premise before had found, that the space between the stars was never quite as empty as it looked. Humanity had learned the hard way, across a very long history, that peace was not a condition. It was a choice, made continuously, backed by the willingness to pay whatever price its defense required. The war fleets were that willingness, made visible, made permanent, made clear, and the galaxy, slowly and with some reluctance, was learning to understand the message they carried. We are here. We remember everything. And we are not going anywhere.